Hello. This week I'm dressed a bit more formally than I am usually. That's because I'm recording this sermon for a broadcast to go out on All Souls Day, the 2nd of November, where we normally have a beautiful Requiem Mass at the cathedral. Several different groups of people have banded together to make wonderful music and lovely recitation of prayers and names. And so that service will be available on our YouTube. However, that'll go out on Tuesday. And today I'm just going to preach about All Souls and what it means for us and what Christians think and believe about life and death. Thomas Hobbes is widely regarded as one of the founding fathers of contemporary Western philosophy. Of course, he wrote several hundred years ago, and he was a decidedly gloomy character. He wrote a lot about death and its inevitability. When he wrote about life, he characteristically used a famous set of words that is oft repeated by others. Life, said Thomas Hobbes, is nasty, brutish and short. Well, I hope our experience of life is a bit different to that. But it is true that our lives are remarkably short and that the inevitability of death hangs over the whole of our lives. And even Christians who like to think that we have our act together when it comes to understanding life and death sometimes find that life is nasty, brutish and short, and that for us middle-class white Australian Anglicans, things are no different than they are for every people in every part of the world. The biblical witness to life and death starts in the Garden of Eden, where God creates a beautiful place for his beautiful creatures to live and enjoy life. And the biblical testimony finishes with a recapitulation, a reimagining of the Garden of Eden in a world recreated after the coming of Christ, where there's a beautiful garden where there is no more sighing nor weeping, nor crying anymore, for the old things have passed away and the new has come. The idea of the Garden of Eden and its restoration is something that Christians have long clung to as they've thought about the meaning of life and death. In the beginning, there's creation and God gives us life. And at the end, there's death and then the promise of a restoration of something beautiful and good and true. The Bible has remarkably little to say about death itself. There are some remarkable stories in the Old Testament, some of them pretty gloomy about death. And in the New Testament, there's that wonderful story of Jesus restoring Lazarus to life. But I wonder what was happening in Lazarus's head for the rest of his living years. He had experienced the thing that every human being fears, and yet then was given another opportunity to live. He must have been a strange and complex character. There are two stories from the Bible that give me encouragement as we look at the reality of life and the inevitability of death. The first is that famous passage from John 14, where Jesus promises that there is a room in the Father's house for everybody. This idea that we all have a room in a large, expansive mansion that is God's home is a lovely image. It must have been even more powerful in a time when many people didn't have much of a home to live in anyway. I think that people often find great comfort at funerals to believe that somehow and somewhere God has a place for each of us. In my Father's house there are many rooms. The second picture we have, of course, comes from the Revelation to St. John chapter 21, where John talks about a city coming down out of heaven, adorned like a bride for her husband. And that's where we get the image of the restored garden, where there is no more crying nor pain anymore, for the old things have passed away and the new has come. So Christians generally disagree with Thomas Hobbes that life is nasty, brutish and short. But we're also realist enough to know that it can be. Sometimes life is nasty, brutish and short. What is it that we can say then about Christian belief about life and death that gives us some comfort. Firstly, it's important to remember that those of us who follow Jesus are not exempt from the realities of life and death. Secondly, there's no way that we can avoid the sadness and pain that comes with death. In every time and every place, people have had in some way to come to terms with the reality of death and to deal with it in a helpful way. You probably all can think about different cultural responses to death. Those Europeans coming to Australia dressed in black for months on end for a time of mourning. The amazing ululation sounds made by Africans at the time of mourning. Our own Indigenous Australian responses to death, those extraordinary tree burials that happen in the Northern Territory. For all of us, death brings pain and sorrow. There's no avoiding it. What then is behind the response of Christians to the realities of life and death? I think the one thing that gives us a sense of difference is that we are very intrinsically people of hope. Not just a sort of pathetic longing for pie in the sky when we die, but people who believe deeply that the God who brings us to life and sustains our living doesn't let us just disappear when this life comes to an end. I think the Christian witness to hope is that the love we experience in this life from God, love that is rooted in the person of Jesus, is not a love that can be destroyed by death. And indeed, that's the point, isn't it, of Jesus' resurrection from the dead. God raises Jesus from death as a first sign that not even death can signal the end of God's love for us. So, it's God's love that brings us to life. It's God's love that sustains our living. And it's God's love that calls us through the gate of death to a new state of life. We don't know exactly what that means. We don't have any pictures to help us to understand what life after death might mean. But the Christian hope, a deeply grounded belief, is that the God who is the God of life and death calls us always to new life and to new beginnings. So as we celebrate All Souls Day and we remember those we have loved and see no more, we commit them to God's love in hope that God will give those we love his place in heaven, that God will give to us a place with him, and that whatever that means, we can trust God, who always reveals himself to us as undying love. The Lord be with you.